coming together of people in the legal community and people in the streets and the communities, folks who are most directly impacted. And there's been some tensions along the way, honestly. These are two communities of people who don't often work well together. And that's really what we're striving to achieve, is that kind of synergy, because if you're going to have a movement that will genuinely seek to democratize defense, you have to have the energy and the passion of the anti-war movement, and you have to have the understanding and the expertise that is to be found in the halls of our state legislators, and in law schools such as Georgetown Law. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies. And thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for that extraordinary challenge to us. I'd like to just also extend my thanks particularly to the National Lawyers Guild. I'm not a lawyer. I, on occasion, play one in the streets because I'm a legal worker, and the Guild is, of course, the only bar association that has welcomed legal workers as well as law students into its organizing, and I would say has played an extraordinary political role in making clear the partisanship that is a necessary part of being a good lawyer in a troubled democracy such as our own. So thanks to the Guild. I wanted to pull back a little bit to the broader question. I know this is the usual thing that lawyers do too, but so do others, to say, I know the question was X, but I'm really going to answer Y, because I'm more interested in Y. And I think you all are actually more interested in Y too. So, if not, I'm sorry, but I think it'll work. I wanted to talk a little bit about international law and about the laws of empire and how they differ, because I think this is one of the fundamental challenges that we face in our so-called democracy in this country, in the sense that international law is often asserted as the basis for actions. But if you think about it, it's almost always somebody else's violations of international law that justify our doing something about that may in fact violate international law. And there's nobody else to say, wait a minute, you can't do that. Maybe they did violate that law, but you don't get to do that in response. So, of course, the classic example of this was the 1990-91 Gulf crisis, when the U.S. went out of its way to use bribes and threats and punishments, and I don't have time now to document it all. It's been documented in lots of places, to ensure that it would get a majority vote and no vetoes in the United Nations Security Council authorizing war. So a war that was immoral, devastating to people, horrifying around the world, hated and challenged around the world, could not technically be called illegal because the U.S. had bribed their way into getting a vote in the Security Council that said it is legal, and according to the UN Charter, the Security Council has the right to declare war. Now, what was actually going on was that there had been clearly a violation of international law. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was a violation, but it was hardly the first violation committed by a country. It was hardly the first invasion of another neighbor by a country in the Middle East. You had Turkey in northern Cyprus, you had Morocco in western Sahara, and you had Israel all over the place. In Palestine, in Egypt before the Camp David Accords, in Syria, in Lebanon. And none of those occasions led to the U.S. deciding that we have to do something. We have to take the world to war to reverse that violation of international law. So the issue of hypocrisy undermines the entire legitimacy of the U.S. approach towards international law, despite the fact that at the end of the day, answering the question, who decides about war, is actually a pretty easy question. If you're going to be legal about it, there's two ways a war can be legal. And I'll give you a hint. None of them have to do with Congress authorizing it. Because the rest of the world doesn't really care whether Congress authorizes something or not, if what it authorizes is in violation of international law. Nor should they care, I would add. So if you look at those two issues, they're both in the United Nations Charter. Article 51 talks about self-defense, but it's very narrow and very specific when it applies. It's not just oh, we feel threatened today, we get to go to war against anybody, for as long as we want, using whatever weapons we want, anywhere in the world that we want, forever. No, it's not like that. It's very narrow. The conditions are very tightly drawn. The other way is when the Security Council votes to go to war. And that happens not very often, as you know, thankfully. The U.S. chooses the time and place to use sufficient bribes and threats and punishments, to use the United Nations as an instrument of legal validation, to provide the legal validation for what is not possible to make morally validated or morally justifiable. So the question of who decides about war in this country is also relatively easy. It's the combination of the oil corporations, the weapons producers, the campaign finance people, the mercenary corporations, and then the decision gets relayed through campaign finance, through the financing of candidates. It gets relayed to the people who then sit publicly and make those decisions in the halls of Congress, in the White House, in the Pentagon, in the State Department, etc. So if we look at those challenges, how does that play out in the real world? You have a scenario, and this is why it does matter, despite the fact that those forces that I just mentioned, the oil corporations, the weapons producers, etc., they don't change from year to year, from candidate to candidate, from president to president. They're pretty consistent. Once in a while you'll see a shift here and there, but they're pretty consistent in what they want, money and power, and how they're willing to get it, anything possible. What does change is who gets elected. And that's why when I say we are a flawed democracy, we are not a fascist state. Democracy is a tricky business, and we don't do it very well. Our elections don't often elect those who should be elected. But on occasion, you do see that. On occasion, there is success, and somebody gets elected who was not the first choice of those various forces. Ironically, President Barack Obama, who has not acted as if he wasn't the first choice of some of those forces, was not the first choice. And his election, not only, although most importantly, historically, the first African American to win the office of President of the United States, something that cannot be undermined despite our criticisms of what his policies have been. But also the first candidate to build the kind of movement that was built in 2008 based on the notion, I will end the war. That was huge. That was huge. Because that was not the position of those majority controllers of the corporations and the weapons producers, et cetera, who generally make the decisions. We managed to trump them by a small amount. And the question now is, what do we do about that? What do we do to make it real? What do we do to change the policies? Because that's where we haven't seen quite as much change. The question of decision-making, you know, you can look at it if we look at the current wars and near wars that the U.S. is involved with. You have in Iraq, the president has campaigned on the basis, I will end the war, and built this extraordinary movement on that basis. Now, the war is still continuing. We don't hear a lot about it. There are still 130,000 U.S. troops, about 150,000, last count, U.S. mercenaries, fighting in Iraq. Are there the same levels of casualties that have been going on? No. Will they rise again? Maybe. But is the war going on? Absolutely. Iraq is still at war. However, the technical requirements of the U.S.-Iraq agreement, the so-called SOFA agreement, are being adhered to so far. The question is, for how long will that be the case? Will the U.S. abide by the requirements of the SOFA that it withdraw all of its identified combat troops, which is somewhere between 80 and 100,000, depending on who in the Pentagon you ask, leaving behind anywhere from 50,000 or more behind? Will they pull them all out by next summer? Not clear. Will they pull out, crucially, all U.S. troops, bar none, from Iraq by December 31st, 2011? We don't know. We know that if we don't demand it, it's not going to happen. We know it's not going to happen because we elected a president who said he was going to end the war. But there is room to maneuver there. On Afghanistan, we saw the opposite. We saw a president who came to power based on a campaign that said, I will end the war in Iraq, and I will escalate the war in Afghanistan. Nobody can claim that President Obama is not doing what he said he would. He said he would escalate in Afghanistan, and he's doing it. We didn't challenge him sufficiently during the campaign. We did challenge. I think it's not fair to say nobody knew, nobody challenged, nobody talked about it. There was plenty of challenge, but there wasn't enough. There wasn't enough saying, you're saying that precisely because you're worried you won't have credentials, you won't have your military chops if you don't find a war you can call your own, when you say that you're running on the basis of an anti-war platform. We didn't say that enough, and we failed. And so what happens? President Obama gets sworn in, and within weeks, he deploys an additional 21,000 new troops and says, now we're going to talk about a strategy. How backward is that? You send the troops, and then you decide why you're going to send troops? And this is insane. In Iran, we have the opposite. And Iran, at the moment, there is an incredible moment of hope that I had not felt as of 48 hours ago. 48 hours ago, I was doing my numbers, and it wasn't looking good. I was up to somewhere between 65, 70%. Things are going to get really bad in Iran. I shouldn't say in Iran, but for Iran, because of our government decisions. Right now, we're seeing something very different. There was this escalation of rhetoric, threats across the board, clear divisions within the administration, but nobody willing to back down. And then suddenly, they do what they so grudgingly said they might do, but maybe not, and wouldn't take it seriously anyway. They went in and negotiated. Now again, is that going to be the last we hear of the negotiations? Hard to tell. Right now, it was an optimistic start. Only because they didn't go in saying these are the preconditions, which everybody knew was the message to say these are not serious negotiations. We're negotiating here only because we want to be able to say when we impose extra harsh sanctions, or God forbid when we use a military strike, or say yes to Israel, you can use a military strike, that we tried diplomacy. This was real negotiations on both sides. And it leaves open the possibility that I think gives us something to work for. And that is a nuclear weapons-free zone across the Middle East that would require all countries to open up everything in their country to the international nuke inspection agencies, the IAEA. Because there is a dangerous, provocative nuclear arsenal in the Middle East, which is creating a nuclear arms race across the Middle East, and that is held by Israel. It's the only nuclear power in the Middle East. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. According to the U.S. National Intelligence estimate, it doesn't even have a nuclear weapons program that's viable. But Israel does. It has between 200 and 400 high-density nuclear bombs in its Dimona plant. And the U.S. agrees that it won't acknowledge that. But every country in the region and every person in the region knows it's there, and it's a big chunk of what's fueling a nuclear arms race. We need a nuclear weapons-free zone. And the irony here, and this is where we come back to international law in the U.S., and I'm going to end with this part. Because I think on the question of nuclear weapons, we have a chance. We have a chance to have some victories here for a policy going our way, not only a campaign that looked like it might go our way. And that is because the United States is already on record supporting a nuclear weapons-free zone across the Middle East. In fact, it's on record supporting something broader, a weapons of mass destruction-free zone across the Middle East. And how do I know that? It's because it's the language of Article 14 of UN Resolution 687, which was the resolution that ended the war, the ceasefire resolution that ended the U.S. war in Iraq in 1991. And Article 14 says that all of this pressure on Iraq should be part of the goal of achieving a zone in the Middle East free of all weapons of mass destruction. Free and full stop. No exception for Israel. No exception for Iran. No exceptions. That's what we need, is international law that applies to everybody. Not a law of empire that says, international law is for the rest of you. For us, there is the law of empire. That's our job. That's the job of lawyers. That's the job of activists. We got a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. And thanks for leading off the panel. And Next up, we have Jeff Ballard, Chair of the Board of Directors of Iraq Veterans Against the War.
I actually wanted to start off by addressing something. I actually went in the military in 1998 when I was fresh out of high school at 17, and I just recently finished my Bachelor's of Arts in American Studies from SUNY Buffalo, where I spent a semester teaching American pluralism. I taught race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability by examining the first-person narratives from the Iraq War. And I've spent the last 5 years working with Iraq Veterans Against the War and actually working that narrative and using that narrative. So taking a look at it from an intellectual perspective and stepping back and actually having to teach a class of 50 students this was a very new thing to me. And so what I'm going to try and do here is a little bit different than what Phyllis did. I'm going to try and answer X, the question that was posed. Okay? So let me actually grab it right from here and read it and see if I can answer it, which I'm sure not, but I'll try. Peace advocacy and defense reform, an oxymoron or a necessity? An oxymoron? Yes. A necessity? Most assuredly so. And they're not, the two are not necessarily opposed to each other. There's plenty of oxymorons that still operate in everyday necessity. When I spent a year in Iraq, we depended very heavily on military intelligence, which is certainly an oxymoron. Okay? But how do we do this? And I'm not a lawyer, although looking around here, it looks like several jail cells I've been in with how many of you have actually been arrested with. So, but I'm not going to speak on a legal aspect of it, but instead look at it from the lens of how IBAW is organizing right now, which is a grassroots organizing effort. We've slimmed down our national staff at IBAW. We have hired on 3 field organizers, and we are organizing veterans and GIs to withdraw their support for military occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, that's a mouthful, but what does it actually mean? That's one of those things that's really easy to say in a training or up from a stage like this, but the work to do it is actually really difficult. Because as we've seen, the military now meets its quotas for recruiting very easily in the economic downturn. And soldiers are afraid to get off of active duty for fear that they're not going to find a job. They're not going to have the healthcare system that they have in TRICARE. So as long as there is still that economic power holding someone within the military, asking them to resist is extremely difficult. So that organizing work goes around making the spectrum of resistance, which goes from just starting to think about whether or not these wars and occupations are wrong, all the way to the extreme, which would be turning and fighting for the other side, which I'm not advocating for, but if we start at thinking and making just questioning the war in one's own head perfectly acceptable, to blogging about the war. We're seeing Selena Kopa from Germany, is an active duty sergeant who was harassed out of the military by her chain of command simply for blogging about her experiences. Seeing blogs that were from Iraq, like FTS Soldier, Fighting to Survive Soldier, which was set up in 2005 by Garrett Reppenhagen and a few others in IBAW, that's been shut down by the military. They're limiting access to the web by soldiers because they don't want those stories to come home. Because when those stories come home, there's a webisode recently out, and a quote from mine made in there, and I still stand by it, which is that all war stories are inherently anti-war if you tell the truth of what happened. They're inherently anti-war. Think about the most courageous thing you could think about in war. Someone under fire, already wounded, runs into a burning Humvee to drag out his bike. That's one of the most heroic war stories you could possibly tell. Does anyone in here want their son to be that person? Does anyone want their son to be the shot buddy that's laying in that vehicle being dragged out under fire? Not really. So when we start to really examine the experiences of veterans in wartime, they're inherently anti-war. And those experiences, I think, translated to the American public is extremely important in what we do. And being able to secure the ability for soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors, to actually tell their stories and make that a safe thing to do. Even though it's completely legal, those of us who've been in the military know that the military rarely considers legality in its actions. But the fact of the matter is it's completely legal, but yet it's consistently punished for doing that, unless you do it through their official sites. When I was in Iraq in 2005, some of you may recall this story, my unit was selected to talk via video conference with George Bush, and they selected a few of the soldiers. And then video leaked out of the briefing beforehand, where they were briefed on exactly what to say to President Bush, to make sure that they didn't ask something, you know, silly like, when are you going to end this freaking war, which a lot of us were thinking in 2005. And so these kinds of things, and then soldiers who spoke out were punished. Okay, so making that safe. This is the kind of work that IVAW is doing right now. The kind of work that IVAW members are doing are things like out in Fort Lewis, Washington, where they opened up Coffee Strong, a coffee house right outside the gates of Fort Lewis. We have another coffee house right outside of Fort Hood, Texas, which is Under the Hood. Thank you. Under the Hood Cafe. And when we work to do this, so let me bring it back then to the necessity part and the oxymoron part, which is the oxymoron of peace activists talking about defense strategy. Well, how is that possible? Well, how is it not possible? We're peace activists. Should we not be concerned about what our military does? We should own that military. Just because you're a pacifist doesn't mean you should stop caring about what that military does, because when you're overseas, it doesn't matter whether you're a pacifist back home. When your military is overseas, we still should own that. And we have to understand how we are perceived overseas, and that American military is your military even though you're a peace activist. They are still your military. They're still from this country. They still fight in your name. And if we cede that debate, if we cede that section of the debate and say, you guys handle national security, we'll just be out in the streets once you guys decide to go to war. The problem with ceding that is that every time you do that, the only option they have, the only definition, if you look at the history, is offensive war. That's their definition. That's their definition of defense. It's really a game of it's like shell game when they change the name from the War Department to the Defense Department. They just quickly move the shells around. You know, we're not at war anymore. We're defending ourselves. But if you take a look, where in the history of America have we actually been defending ourselves in a war? You know, I mean, it's just, if you really study history, there's not one. Okay? So again, but how do we do that? How do we define it? How do we begin to take charge of that? And I'm not going to claim to have all the answers, but I have one part of it, which is we can start to reclaim our military. We can start to do that work. We can start to make sure that when they start talking about National Guard forces, that we don't elect a governor who's willing to allow his National Guard to be illegally used in an occupation overseas, which right now, every Guard deployment, including my own, is illegal. And a governor, we have yet to have a governor step up and say, you're not taking my National Guard. Why are those governors then getting our votes? Why is this issue not even raised there? And it starts as from us making that our military, making that our effort, starting to go out to these places, talk to these soldiers, the soldiers that are in your communities, the soldiers that are in your families. It's easier to just let it go and to not be confrontational about it. It's an easy route to go. But I was having lunch with my boss at my job. I work for a homeless shelter now. I run an initiative to end homelessness among veterans here in the district. And I was having lunch with my boss today, and we talked about how when veterans come home, we're told, take your medals and sit down and shut up. But it should be the opposite. We should be encouraging our soldiers to tell us everything that they did. First of all, it's good for the soldier, actually. It's good not to bottle it down for 20 years. And literally bottle it down, because that's how a lot of veterans are dealing through a bottle. It's better to actually tell those stories. It's better for our society. It's better for us having an understanding of what actually happens when we say the defense of this country. because that's how each of these wars is built. And as we start to learn from these, some of the things that we need to learn are, Bill's brought up an excellent point of President Obama went after Afghanistan because he needed his military chops. He needed to be strong on defense. But the reality of it is, what was defense? What is he being strong on? There's a great book that IPS actually helped put out, Lessons from Iraq, that I taught from in my class. And there's 10 lessons in it, right? There's 10 lessons. If we actually learned those lessons as a country, we wouldn't have another Iraq, I guarantee you that. And we wouldn't have another of these offensive wars. And so I'd highly recommend picking that up. And so on my last point, I want to kind of address who is making that now. Who's making the decisions on what defense means right now? It's a series of think tanks that unfortunately is not IPS. I really wish it was. But it's mostly think tanks that are the ousted party. And what happens is you have these officials who go work while their party's in power, they go work for the government, and then when their party's not, they go work in these think tanks, and they feed their powers. I mean, the Center for American Progress is a great example of that. They fund Democrats. They love Democrats. They love to say that they're against the war, but the reality is they continue to support Democrats who are very pro-occupation. And so we see that, and what happens is you have these types of things that co-opt movements like ours. And we have to make sure that our movements aren't co-opted, that we don't go into there. And we really have to hold people that claim to represent us to the fire. I now represent Iraq Veterans Against the War as the chair of the board. As soon as I stop representing IVAW to the way that my members want IVAW to be represented, I would hope they drag me out of office. I would hope so. That's the kind of thing that we need, not physically dragging people out of office. I'm not advocating for this physical dragging. Others may, I'm going to be clear that we're not, but a metaphorical dragging them out of the office is yes. We need to make sure that this is our work, and that we don't cede this work to others. And that we don't, because it's hard, and I know that a lot of people, working people, my mother's one of them, she works at Home Depot, she makes $12 an hour. When she gets home from a 40-hour week, she doesn't want to go do policy stuff. She barely has time to read the newspaper. But yet she finds a way to do it. She's a sustaining donor to IVAW. She has a big sign on the front of her house. She goes to the marches. She does the work. And she challenges candidates. She goes out to the forums and challenges the candidates. She makes sure that she's an informed person. A lot of what I do is modeled because of what she does and what she's accomplished. It's made me a better activist, a better person, and I think that that's the kind of level that I would hope that we're striving to as citizens. Because if we're not taking charge of this system, then it won't be just a flawed democracy. And right now it is a flawed democracy. And if we're not working out those flaws, then they're working to put more of them in. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, we've heard from X and we've heard from Y, so I think it's time for Z. Please welcome Elaine Brower of Military Families Speak Out and the Bring the Guard Home Steering Committee. And don't worry about, there we go. Please put your hands together. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's good to be here tonight. Thanks for having me. I wanted to sort of step back even further from where Phyllis and Jeff went. And I want to ask the question, what we're asking at this conference, who decides about war and peace? Is it the Congress? Is it the President? Is it the courts? Is it the people? What kind of national defense should the U.S. have? And what type of military? So we're talking about that at this conference. On this panel, we're addressing how peace activists can realistically develop a policy so that the U.S. only fights necessary wars. I would like to answer this question by first asking another question. How can peace activists morally justify any defense of the U.S. imperialist empire? The question begins with the premise that there are times when the U.S. empire must be defended by fighting necessary, quote-unquote, wars, and that peace activists actually have a duty to help shape policies to do so. I reject this notion for several reasons. The U.S. nation is an empire, and it's been so for more than a century. This nation, since its founding, has been based on violence and war. The very fact that this land constitutes now the U.S. was seized from indigenous peoples through violence and genocide. Millions of people from Africa were forcibly seized and brought here to increase the wealth of a small class of people. A large chunk of Mexico was forcibly taken by the U.S. in the 1800s. In the 1890s, the U.S. was no longer satisfied with the land in North America, and it seized Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. In the 20th century, the U.S. Overthrew numerous governments throughout the world to enforce its imperialist rule. The U.S. fought 2 world wars and several regional wars to obtain and maintain hegemony. In the 21st century, the U.S. is now fighting large wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that we are very familiar with. And these shoes here represent maybe just one child, age 4, who was killed in Iraq. But there are millions of them in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's what it represents. U.S. hegemony, imperialist empire. The U.S. also uses forces to kill people in Pakistan, Somalia, Sudan, Colombia, and the Philippines, just to name a few countries where people have become victims of the U.S. war of terror. None of these wars and military actions, none of them were voted by the people of this country. Most were initiated by the president as commander-in-chief, and in some cases the Congress voted for war, and in all cases the Congress funded the wars. Both the White House and Congress represent a relatively small ruling class. The interests of this class were the reasons the U.S. went to war each and every time. The general public is fed propaganda, which is necessary to build a base of support for the wars, but has very little to do with reality. Neocon Paul Wolfowitz made clear that we are fed lies to justify wars when he admitted the WMDs became the public reason for the invasion of Iraq because that was the one reason members of the ruling class could agree to put out to the public. So the public bought this, hook, line, and sinker, just like they're buying in Afghanistan. We are trying to liberate women. This conference asks, who decides about war? Well, it is clear not the people. The people of the U.S. do not decide about war. We can be damn sure the ruling class is not going to consult with the peace movement or peace activists. And we are delusional if we think we can rely on our elected representatives to represent our interests as long as we pressure them enough as regards to war. The majority of Americans now oppose the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Do we see a rush by congressional representatives and senators to end the wars? Has Congress refused to vote to fund the wars? Has Obama ordered all the troops home? No, they haven't. And it is not because politicians do not know how to read polls. Instead, Obama has escalated the wars in Afghanistan and now into Pakistan. He has continued the war in Iraq. He is keeping all options on the table in regard to Iran. Let's look at the elections. In 2006, the Democratic Party, who allegedly represent the interests of the middle and working class, assumed control of Congress. This effect was directly caused by people who were fed up with the war in Iraq. Did they defund? No, they funded it 10 more times. They cried that Bush was the executive in power. They said they had no power because the Bush administration was way too powerful. So the people went back to the polls, and they voted in a historic election, and they brought a Democratic president in with a full majority in Congress, Democrats. Did this change either the way the executive branch or the Congress viewed the wars? Absolutely not. Can the American people end these imperialist wars? Yes, we can. But it will not happen at the ballot box or because we are willing to beg at the feet of our elected officials. It will take a mass movement that is willing to take to the streets to end the wars. We have to have an in-your-face attitude. We have to not tolerate the wars one more day. We have to say in no uncertain terms that no imperialist wars are necessary to the people, even if they are necessary for the ruling class. Their interests are not our interests. Our system of government is set up to keep the working class in a position to support the ruling class in the lifestyle to which they have become accustomed. The Democratic Party is simply there to make us confused and make us think they are listening to us. The only battles that have been won throughout history are those that have fought in the streets, from suffragettes to civil rights, to women's rights, to GI rights, to LGBT rights. Anything won was not because the government decided to hand it over to the people, but because the people decided to take it. We must bring war criminals to justice, or else nothing we do will matter. If we do not prove that there are war criminals in this country, and I'm not talking about in South America or in Herzegovina, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, I'm talking about here, we have war criminals amongst us. If we do not demand that they be brought to justice, then we will never ever end any wars of aggression. And we will never have peace here or around the world for humanity. Defending U.S. hegemony is morally indefensible. So, the questions we should be asking are, do we really want to live in an imperialist empire? If not, we cannot be complicit with it. We have to completely change the system. Thank you.
We have some rich perspectives here tonight, and I'm very grateful to all of you who took the time and traveled and made time in your busy schedules to be here. And thank you for the passion, too, in the work. I want to introduce our next speaker, which is Kevin Zeese, and I should also say, while Kevin is coming up here, that we will have an opportunity for some discussion as well once each of our panelists have made their presentation. Thank you.
Well, a lot of good comments. When I saw the peace advocacy and defense reform, it made me think about what a successful linguistic approach our government has taken to call it a defense budget. That's a term I think that's an oxymoron, that's right. And I think if we are going to engage in so-called defense reform, one of the things you have to do is take back the language. And I would suggest, I'm going to talk about 3 areas around that. Because if we really had a defense budget, it wouldn't look anything like the budget that we currently have. We wouldn't be spending as much as the whole world combined on weapons and military and war. And so the first thing I want to say is that it's really an offense budget. It's really a weapons budget. It's a war budget. And the change from the war agency to the Department of Defense, I think was a brilliant linguistic move on the parts of those who favor war. And so changing the term starts with not accepting that term defense. So-called defense budget, weapons budget, military budget, those are more accurate descriptions. And we should never allow the word to be defense budget. I think we need to start from that point and not allow that. The second thing I want to build on is what Elaine just was talking about, which is another term we need to get into the American political dialogue, which is empire. I was watching a CNN discussion. He's that Newsweek writer who's on CNN, the Pakistani guy. I'm sure you know him. Fareed, that's right. And he was asking, is the United States an empire? I thought that I'd never heard that question on national television before. It was a pretty interesting question. He concluded we were not an empire. And I like to, it's when you think about empire, I think about exit plans, and I'm waiting for the exit plan from the Spanish-American War and the, let's get out of Cuba. How about the World Wars? I think the only country we really got out of was Vietnam. Korea, Iraq, we're in there. And so if we change the dialogue and start talking about empire, and people start realizing what empire costs us, why is it that in Japan they're building robots that will clean the house, or a pet dog for the elderly person, and we're building drones? Robotics are still expanding, but for us it's weapons robotics. And you could look at a whole series of issues. I mean, you're going to find in our country that the leading green technology agencies will be the Department of Defense. That's where all the money is. And so on issue, you're going to see on overall, we're buying subways made in Italy because we don't make them here. Why? Because we make weapons here. So empire has lots of costs. And once we start talking about the United States as an empire and bring home what that means to our daily lives, to our urban areas that are in decay, to every road we drive on has cracks and holes in it, and we have to constantly get our cars repaired because the roads are so bad. We are feeling that pain every day. Every day we can look around and see the cost of empire. And we're a waning empire on top of that. And so once you start to talk about empire and discuss what is it like to live in a waning empire, an empire that's overstretched, an empire that doesn't produce, an empire that's in debt at every level of government, at the business level, at the consumer level, you see a country that's weakening. And what happens to empires that wane? What happens to empires that wane? And so we need to look at what happened. Rome is now a tiny boot on the end of the Mediterranean. And what will we become? Well, Florida will be gone, so we won't be a boot, thanks to climate change. So, offense and not defense, empire, and the third point I want to talk about is corporate welfare. How much of this military budget really is one more form of corporate welfare? We see in every debate in Congress, corporate welfare rears its head. But when it comes to the military, the corporate welfare is especially ugly because it's based on murder. It's based on destruction. It's an ugly form of corporate welfare. I mean, obviously the insurance industry is denying care and people dying, 45,000 Americans a year dying because of lack of health care. That's a pretty ugly form of corporate welfare as well. And this ugly bill that Obama's pushing that's going to put hundreds of billions of dollars into these insurance industry pockets is a form of corporate welfare as well. But the military-industrial complex is a serious form of corporate welfare. And you see President Obama putting in number 2 in the Defense Department, a former lobbyist for weapons manufacturers, and he's in charge of contracting for more weapons. The ugliness of it is just astounding. So if we're going to discuss really reforming our military budget, we need to change those terms. We need to bring those in. Can you imagine what it'd be like if those kind of issues really were discussed on television regularly? If we talked about empire and corporate welfare and who's getting richer off the military, who's getting poor off the military budget, what is this? Is this really a defensive budget or an offensive budget? What does a defensive budget look like? It would be a whole different debate. And so that's our job, is to change that debate. Now, when it comes to who decides war, I looked at the schedule. I'm not going to be able to be here tomorrow, but I see it's, and I'm the token lawyer. And so I noticed all the law being discussed, but it's not really a question of law. I mean, Phyllis is right. The law that matters is international law. It's the question of wars of aggression. That's a term of art, a legal term of art in international law. And every war we're fighting currently is a war of aggression, because they don't meet the standards that Phyllis put out that were very clear on under attack or approved by the Security Council. It's just not what's happening. And so, you know, we are in the process of fighting wars of aggression, and we need to recognize that the reason we're doing this is because our politics is broken. And Elaine is right. We're not going to solve this through the ballot box. You know, President Obama's "I will end the war," he started every speech that way. And look at the details of what he said. His ending the war in Iraq was leaving tens of thousands of troops, 100,000 mercenaries, military bases that don't leave, the biggest embassy in the world, intelligence gathering from the Middle East. It was not ending the war. It was transforming the war until we had won and are staying, as we say in every previous war. You look at his comments on Pakistan. I'll bomb Pakistan without permission. I'll escalate the war in Afghanistan. I'll support Israel over Palestine. I'm going to expand the military budget. This was not a peace candidate. And the peace movement was sadly fooled. And movements cannot stop and start every 2 years. We were fooled in 2004 with John Kerry. We stopped, let him talk about killing the terrorists, let him talk about expanding the wars, here for service. 2006, we were fooled by the Democrats running on anti-war planks, getting elected and not doing anything, and we were fooled by President Obama. When are we going to learn that our system is so broken that we're not going to get the solution from that direction? We need to really do so much more. We do a great deal. I don't want to, I mean, the peace movement has done a great deal. Look at the changes in public opinion on Iraq. Look at the views on Afghanistan. We have really got majority support on our side, and a lot because we're out there putting out the facts. So I do give us some credit. We're not the only reason why it's like that, but we are doing a lot of education, a lot of organizing that is great. But it's necessary, but insufficient. We need to do more. And if we start to get clear on what this is about, we're going to find new political alliances. Because there are people who oppose empire from all across the political spectrum. People who are seen as on the right, people who are seen in the radical center, people who are seen on the left. There's an opposition to empire across the political spectrum. And so we start to change the terms of debate, start to face the realities of what's going on. We can start to create a new culture in the United States. And that's really, it's a cultural change, and that will lead to political change. And so I urge us, not to be fooled by these promises of presidents and members of Congress running for office, but instead to stay true to our principles. Next time there's a president who says, "I will end war," and then says, "I'm going to bomb Pakistan," we should be protesting. When he says, "I'm going to expand Afghanistan," we should be protesting. When he says, "I'm going to support Israel over Palestine," we should be protesting. We should not remain silent in election years. In fact, we should be escalating. We should be escalating our anti-war efforts in election years when these phony candidates come forward and put forward these plans to expand wars and expand empire. And the thing I'm actually most worried about with Obama, and as much as I think the greatest thing about President Obama, well, there's one thing I like about him, but one thing I really like about him is that he is African American. I think that is a great breakthrough for so many people, for such a great symbol for our country. What I worry about on the other side of that coin is when he visits Africa and starts talking about building bases. You look at the maps of where the military bases are in this country, Africa has not got there yet. And a black commander-in-chief is very dangerous for Africa. So I really worry about that as the next area of conflict, and I think in the next decade we'll probably start to see wars over resources in Africa. It started with President Bush and Africa Command, and Obama now is continuing that, and sadly, President-in-Chief, Commander-in-Chief, who's African American, is a problem with that. The other thing I like about Obama, which I think we should take to heart, is that he says, "Hold me accountable. Hold me accountable." This is the guy who says the end of war. It's time for us to hold him accountable. Thank you.
One thing that jumps out at me is that, as Kevin said, this is a very broad question that impacts many communities, and the Bring the Guard Home campaign is no exception to that. We there may actually be more diversity of opinion on this panel than you might think, and I think we'll get into some of that as we move forward. But in terms of the Guard Home campaign, there are many people who are concerned about these fundamental questions regarding war powers and executive power in particular. So that in the state of Oregon, there are 9 Republicans who stepped forward to support the Guard Home legislation. In the state of Wisconsin, the Libertarian Party is working with the Democratic Party and the Green Party to pass this legislation. And this is becoming a very broad and also sometimes difficult coalition that we're building over the months to reform defense policy in the United States. So I just wanted to take that opportunity to let you know that some of these discussions and broad conversations are happening. Our cleanup batter tonight is a gentleman that I know that many people are excited to see, and he doesn't want any more introduction, I can tell. So please welcome Jeremy Scahill.
So I was asked tonight to speak about the Olympic bid for the
Chicago.
Yes, it's going to a Latin American nation now of Brazil, and let's hope that it doesn't wreak havoc on the poor and working people of Brazil, which oftentimes when the Olympics come to town, the poor people are the ones that pay for it. The dissidents also are rounded up in some countries, as we saw, including China, where Bush spent 4 days hanging out there while the war was deteriorating worse and worse. And now Obama was chastised for going over for a day to Denmark. And the reason that I bring this up is because we are living in bizarro world, in the sense that we have a rise in the prominence and popularity of outright lunatics in this country that are being led by hucksters and snake oil salesmen, people like Glenn Beck and others. And I think that I wish that Jimmy Carter was the president in the way that he's the man now. I wish that the Jimmy Carter of today was the president then, because he has, in this sense, he has called the question on U.S. support for Israel in a way that no president sitting or past would have done. And he was boxed out of a speaking role at the Democratic National Convention because of his very outspoken criticism of the sort of sacred cow of U.S. foreign policy. And then more recently, he called out the racism that we see now against Barack Obama, precisely because you have these fanatical racists that cannot tolerate the fact that a black man is the president of the United States. You watch the joint session of Congress address that Obama did on health care, and you see the look on the faces of those Republican senators and congressmen, and you can tell exactly what they're thinking as they sit in those chairs staring at Barack Obama. And the irony of this is that seldom, I think, has empire had a greater ally in terms of advancing itself than Barack Obama. In fact, he probably is going to be a much more successful emperor, to keep playing with the term that Kevin so rightly put out, than John McCain ever would have been. Barack Obama is going to clean up the image of the United States so that corporate interests are extended and served. Look at his team of economic advisors. Look at his team of foreign policy advisors. We have a kettle of hawks running the foreign policy. Did you know that kettle is the plural for a group of hawks? They call them a kettle. Anyway, I learned that. And then he also has a gang of neoliberal crooks running U.S. economic policy. These are people that early on, when they were appointed, won widespread praise, not from liberals, not from progressives, not from radical anti-war folks, but from neoconservatives, people like Bill Kristol, and they use words like gobsmacked. We're gobsmacked with these appointments. They were ecstatic about the team that Barack Obama was able to pull together. Empire is not going to see a better friend in terms of actual corporate interests being advanced around the world than Barack Obama. So all of this is to say that these people who are out there with their racist signs and their pictures of the president as a witch doctor and the Joker face over him and all of the horribly misspelled attempts to be clever when they say he's a Muslim. I mean, I don't know what you think of the material Muslim, but apparently these people are very much against Muslim. They called him a half-breed Muslim. It was one sign. So we have this situation where the discourse is now millions of people that watch Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly, who largely are actual certifiable crazy people. And then you have sort of the rest of the country that is engaging in debate and discussion, hopefully, on a lot of issues of national importance. We could have two discussions here tonight. One would be about the sort of long-term battle on how you actually change the fundamentals of the system in this country so that some of what Elaine and others have talked about tonight could be advanced in terms of a proactive strategy. I don't think we have the time tonight to get into that kind of a discussion because some of the issues in front of us are so pressing that I think it's more important to talk strategically about how to address those issues that we actually can impact at this point. I want to co-sign much of what Kevin said on the issue of using the term defense reform. I do think that it's genius. When it was the Pentagon, was originally referred to as the War Department, and then they changed it to the Defense Department. In fact, I remember being with Dan Berrigan at the Pentagon once during a protest, and he said that when this place was built, the Pentagon, they said that after the war they were going to turn it into a hospital, and he said you've got to give them credit because they kept their word. It's the biggest insane asylum in the world. And I think it's important as we look at the scandal, the utter scandal of lack of health care for people in this nation, compare the crisis and the casualties or the deaths from lack of health care to those inflicted on the United States of America by Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden or the resistance in Afghanistan or the resistance in Iraq. The premier national security issue of our time is health care in this country. And yet, you see billions upon billions of dollars being spent to occupy nations abroad that pose no actual threat to the United States, and then spineless Democrats refusing to stand up for not just a public option, but for single-payer health care in this country. All of the casualties and deaths, I'm using the term casualties because it's their term, that are caused by the war on the uninsured or the half-insured or the partially insured in this country can be directly linked back to decisions made by those ostensibly elected by the people to represent them, and they have utterly failed to do that. If there was ever a moment in the history of this country where the Democratic Party had an opportunity to sharply distinguish itself from the Republican Party, it began in 2006 and is in its heyday right now, where the Democrats have a massive majority in the Congress, they control the White House, and as things shift, they may even end up controlling the judicial branch of government. And so rather than sort of whining about how this isn't the change we can believe in and Obama hoodwinked us, I agree with Elaine that Obama telegraphed many of the passes, and certainly what Phyllis said, that we are now seeing him throw on the domestic and international stage. The Democrats, when they were elected in 2006, were largely elected to a majority, and when Nancy Pelosi swept the power, because people were fed up with the war. They were fed up with the Republican monopoly on government, with the out-of-control spending, with the bodies coming home from these wars, and they wanted change. The crowning achievement of Nancy Pelosi's time as Speaker of the House was to achieve approval ratings lower than those of President Bush, and it was an extraordinary achievement on her part. She had to work very hard to become less popular than President Bush, and almost as unpopular as Dick Cheney, the least popular politician in the history of this country, perhaps. And now we have a situation where even those Democrats that pledged to stand against war funding are backing down in the face of threats from the White House. I don't know how many of you followed what happened in June of this year, but there was an incredible opportunity for anti-war Democrats in the Congress to actually have power, to actually have a moment when they could impact real politics in the United States when it came to the issues that are important to anti-war people in this country. And that was when the White House attached $100 billion in funding to the International Monetary Fund to the Defense Authorization Bill. The reason why that's significant is because all of the Republicans voted against it with the exception of 5. What that meant is in order to pass the war funding bill for Afghanistan and Iraq, Barack Obama and Rahm Emanuel and Hillary Clinton had to have at least 39, they had to have at least one or two of the 39 solid anti-war votes turned, flipped them. And so what they did is Emmanuel and Hillary Clinton and Obama began threatening freshman Democrats who were anti-war and saying, you will be a one-term congressperson if you do not vote with us on this bill. They said you will never hear from us again. We won't raise money for you. We won't be there for you if you get into an intense re-election battle. Imagine being a first-term congressperson elected on a wave of this incredible support for Obama that we saw, unprecedented voter turnout, young people voting in huge droves. You rode to Congress on that, thinking that you were a part of something that was going to change Washington, and then the first big vote, where you're going to represent what you told your constituents you would vote for, you then have to back down and turn, or flip. And so they flipped some of those anti-war Democrats, and that authorization passed very, very narrowly. I talked to one congressperson who told me that they received a phone call personally from President Obama asking them to flip their vote, despite the fact that they had signed a pledge not to vote for war funding. In the Senate, you only had 3 senators vote against the war funding the last time around. Predictably, Bernie Sanders, and then also Russ Feingold, who, while still not fully around to the position that the United States should be completely out of Afghanistan, is increasingly moving toward that position. I tell you this story because what this means is that we have only 30 representatives in the House that actually have stood against the war. 30 out of 256 Democrats. We have 30 that actually have stood against the war. In the Senate, we have, from the Democrats, 1, Russ Feingold, the lone Democrat to vote against that funding. Bernie Sanders is technically not a Democrat, he's an independent. 1 Democrat in the Senate, 30 in the House. What that means is that the war party has the supermajority. The war party doesn't have to worry about its trough being drained. It doesn't have to worry about its funding being cut off, because the anti-war Democrats have been intimidated, bullied, and some of them had their spines surgically removed, and that's why they didn't vote with their constituents or vote with their pledges. So we had 51 Democrats in total that had said they would vote against the war and then didn't vote against war funding when it mattered. They voted against it when it didn't matter early on and then flipped their votes 2 months later. What also happened was that Rahm Emanuel cut deals with the Republicans and promised to go light on certain Republicans in 2010, and they flipped a handful of Republicans in that vote and got 5 of them to vote with the White House, despite the fact that the IMF money was attached to it. So who is when we talk about defense reform, as the phrase has been put out there, Obama has been an incredibly successful reformer, because he's reformed the support for the war now that a Democrat is in power. Those Democrats that did spine up and would stand up against Bush, and there were only a few of them, many of them now have kind of been pulled over to the Obama camp under the guise of Afghanistan being the good war. When I was at the Democratic National Convention in Denver, I ran into Jesse Jackson after Obama's speech. And I went up to him and I said, Reverend Jackson, we heard tonight Barack Obama invoking the legacy of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King's son spoke before Obama at the when he won the nomination, the coronation. And I saw Jesse Jackson and I said, we heard a lot of talk about Martin Luther King in a speech where the candidate elected by the Democrats to be their candidate has actually called for an escalation of war. Isn't there a conflict between those two concepts, where you have an invocation of Martin Luther King's name, a committed pacifist who at great personal risk stood against the war in Vietnam at a time when he was being told by some civil rights activists that it would be a distraction from the civil rights issue. Quite likely the reason why he was killed was uniting people on class, racial, and then anti-war grounds. And then you have Jesse Jackson, who was standing on the balcony with him at the Lorraine Motel when he was killed, and it was sad, because Jesse Jackson started saying that he thinks that Martin Luther King would have supported World War II because it was a just war. And he started talking about the theology of the just war theory. I went back and looked. Martin Luther King was emphatic in his pacifism, both strategically and morally. And so I tell that story not to bash Jesse Jackson, because he's actually come around and is speaking against the war in Afghanistan. But when it mattered, when it mattered, which was before Barack Obama got the nomination, you had utter silence on the part of most Democrats that were all up in arms about how Bush was a war criminal and Bush was leading the country into illegal and illegitimate wars. What about the Democrats who vote for war funding now? What labels can we bestow upon them? Because in addition to all the labels they could levy against the Republicans and Bush and all of that, we also have spinelessness. They check their spines at the door like a mink coat check when they go into the Congress to vote these days, and it's pathetic, and it's sad. So who benefits from this system where you have both major political parties in this country voting consistently for war funding? It's the corporations. The corporations benefit in an unprecedented way at this exact moment. Do you know that Barack Obama, since he became president, has increased the number of mercenaries in both Iraq and Afghanistan in all 3 quarters of this year? In Afghanistan in particular, he's increased the number of armed mercenaries. He continues to have Blackwater on his payroll in both Iraq and Afghanistan, where they work for the State Department, the Defense Department, and the Central Intelligence Agency as part of Obama's drone bombing campaigns in Pakistan and Afghanistan, which every time a bomb is dropped from those planes, it is another war crime. From the moment Obama authorized a Predator strike on January 23rd, 3 days after his inauguration, he himself had committed an act of aggression against a country that the United States is not only not at war with, but is doing bombing there against the wishes of large portions of the Pakistani government. So you have Obama now having committed acts of aggression similar to those committed by President Bush. We hear a lot of talk about Acorn these days. Acorn got $53 million over 15 years, $3.5 million a year. Much of it was in the form of grants to go to support low-income housing and housing for truly poor people. $53 million over 15 years. Last year, the top 100 contractors in this country made $257 billion. The 10 of the top 10 defense contractors have been convicted of fraud or abuse in the last several years. All 10 of the top 10 top defense contractors have actual fraud or abuse convictions where they've had to pay fines to the government. Acorn has not been convicted. Acorn is not a government contractor. And so when you have Democrats standing up and voting to defund Acorn, we need to say to them, where's your defund Blackwater Act? Where's your defund Lockheed Martin Act? Where's your defund KBR Act? If we want to talk about defense reform in this country, we need to talk about targeting those corporations without whom these wars would not be possible. 25 to 40 cents on every dollar the United States spends in Iraq and Afghanistan right now, $2.5 billion a week, 25 to 40 cents goes directly to 630 corporations that are servicing the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There are 500,000 U.S. personnel occupying Iraq and Afghanistan. A full 50% of them are now corporate forces working for for-profit corporations that benefit from a worsening of the situation. We saw all of this coming. Those of us who were paying attention, as Phyllis Bennis has for many, many years, we were right about Iraq and its lack of weapons of mass destruction. Anyone in Baghdad at that time could have picked up a phone and called the White House and said it's a complete fraud. Dick Cheney and Scooter Libby went to the CIA repeatedly to try to get different intelligence when the actual intelligence didn't fit their political agenda. So who does Obama pick when he goes for his foreign policy team? He doesn't pick Russ Feingold, the lone senator, to vote against the Patriot Act. He doesn't pick people who actually were right about Iraq. He picks the very people that promoted the myth that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Hillary Clinton, who voted in 2002 to authorize Bush carte blanche to use force in Iraq and consistently voted for Iraq funding, and promoted the myth that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. Susan Rice, the UN ambassador, promoted the myth that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Robert Gates was a gun runner during the Afghan war in the Reagan years, and now he is Obama's defense secretary, once again involved with Afghanistan. He was wrong then, and he's wrong now. So we have this team of discredited, many of them outright liars, who promoted myths that led the country into war, still at the epicenter of U.S. foreign policy. If we are going to address any of the systemic problems that stem from this unquenchable thirst for more and more profits for these war corporations, we have to take a multi-pronged approach. One is to go after these war companies ad hoc. Go after them in your community. Protest in front of their gates, as people did at Blackwater. People have been doing at KBR. These are companies that electrocute U.S. soldiers. These are companies that give polluted drinking water to U.S. soldiers. These are companies that murder Iraqis in cold blood in the streets. They're bad for the United States of America, and they're bad for the world. They exist in almost every community in this country. I think we have to have campaigns to target them directly. Regarding those Democrats that do not do their job and stand up to cast votes that are consistent with the principles of the people that elected them, I'm talking about those anti-war Democrats, I agree with Jane Hampshire's strategy. You go after them, you fund their opponent, and you send them back to their state to get a lesson in what it means to actually represent people. The moment, though, that we think that we are going to find any form of change from elected officials that is going to substantially challenge the empire is the moment we actually stop being serious people. I think that we should engage Congresspeople. We should look for allies. We should support those that actually do stand up on these issues and cast brave votes in very dark times. But if we cede our conscience to a politician or a political party that is tied intimately to war corporations, then we are actually making ourselves a major part of the problem. So I think we need citizens' movements that are going to challenge elected officials, occupy their offices as brave activists have done, stand with anti-war veterans, as Jeff was saying, and also take on the corporations. One pro-mercenary guy says that these companies, David Eisenberg says, these companies are like the American Express card of U.S. military operations because they can't leave home without them. It's absolutely true. Representative Alan Grayson of Florida has been very brave these days talking about health care, and this is the last thing I'll say. But he also, when the Defund Acorn Act was passed, only 75 Democrats voted against the Defund Acorn Act. None of them are voting to defund any of these war corporations. And Alan Grayson said, you know, the Republicans are so stupid because the drafters of this bill made it so broad that they actually have created the legal framework, if it is found constitutional, to argue that that all of the top war contractors that have been convicted of fraud should immediately be prohibited from receiving federal funds. To me, what Grayson was doing there and what he has been raising here is one of our best issues on the war right now. Let's take that Defund Acorn Act and replicate it over and over. Introduce multiple acts that are the Defund Lockheed Martin Act, the Defund KBR Act, the Defund Blackwater Act. There are people in the Congress now that are looking into this. So I think we have to engage Congress, confront Congress, but not look to them as the solution. Look to hold them accountable, but don't look to them as the solution. Go back to the activism of occupation, not occupation of countries, occupation of offices, occupation of buildings, and target those corporations. Thank you.
I think what we heard from all of our panelists today was that the question of defense reform is much deeper than defense, right? It's much deeper than the question of tinkering with laws as simple as the War Powers Act of 1973. That would be so easy to do, to simply adopt some change in the War Powers Act itself, as it's much broader. And I think that's the movement perspective that is brought to the conference here tonight. I do want to let people know that there are going to be some other perspectives as well throughout the weekend. We have Mort Halperin, who has served in 3 administrations, who will be keynoting tomorrow morning. We do have 3 politicians who I think universally would be agreed to be among those few who stand up time and time again. Rich Madaleno and Jamie Raskin, state senators from Maryland, and a true hero, State Representative Mike Fisher of Vermont as well, who helped to launch the Bring Go Home campaign. We'll be looking at the history of war powers questions in the United States, both semi-ancient in terms of the history of the National Guard, of the regular army from the time of the Revolution on, and also more recent, in terms of more recent debates over War Powers Act reform, the War Powers Act in 1973, and what might be done to change it. and that will be happening in the afternoon. I should say that the reason why we have a Defense Department today, my understanding as a Wisconsinite, is that it was a demand of the peace movement that was co-opted. If you look at the platform of the Progressive Party, they said, why do we have a War Department? So what I say to Dennis Kucinich is, beware of what you ask for if you're fighting for a peace department. The fundamental questions, as you all have said in so many ways, are questions of power in the end. So I will just leave it there. I want to invite everybody to be here throughout all the discussions that you can make tomorrow. And now let's turn it over to a discussion tonight. I believe that these microphones that we have here work. If somebody, one person will be willing to test them, there's a little button on the front. This will be easier for us. Yes. It sounds like it works. Okay, well, very good. So let's do it like this. Let's have 3 questions from the audience, short. Keep them short because there are many of us here who have a lot to offer. And then we will allow the panelists to respond to them, and we'll see how many rounds of questions we can make it through tonight. So let's see who's willing to show the courage to start off tonight. You got one hand, you got another one, 2 and 3. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Jerry, thank you for that wonderful presentation. And I wanted to ask you a question with regard to one of the last suggestions that you made, which was integrating of the dates of the war rocketeers. This is something that our group in Montgomery County has done at Lockheed Martin on Martin Luther King Day for the last few years. And the last year I just decided, okay, this is enough of this because it seems so pointless. We sent out press releases to like 600, there's no media, there's nothing. And it took us, it took me and some others much effort to pull that together, and it's it seems very frustrating, and so I'm just curious as to what your take on that is.
Very good. Question number 1, 2. Hand in the back. Oh, you were that's right. You were next.
Right. I do have some comments that I'll ask. I have 2 questions that I'll ask. Well, first of all, I have a strong impression that there's stuff going on behind the scenes about the people that Obama and other people may or may not be going in with better intentions. But I'm just curious about what anybody might think about, pressure and threats behind the scenes that that's going on, what do you imagine might be going on. And then the other question I have is about conversion, and that military conversion, that if all these corporations are making all this money and they're better on profit, is there, what ideas do people have about some kind of military conversion? Like, can they make money doing something else besides it that's not correct?
Very good. And the third question?
Yeah,
Yeah, if you could use the microphone, that will help you because there are people watching at home right now. Quite a few, actually.
okay. I think that the emphasis on corporations is exactly where it ought to be, and I think that we can't work through our Congress, as was pointed out, but I think that there has to be it has to be narrowed down. And I think if we narrowed a fight down to anything, we should narrow it down to fighting corporate personhood. That is, corporate personhood is the reason why anything like they're declaring war, which they actually are the ones that declare the wars, that happens. And I just wonder what the panel thinks about that. But I think that's at the that's at the base of everything that happens. Corporate personhood, and it actually gets worse. And once we do away with that, maybe we can do away with it state by state. I know this is a statement, but state by state or something. But once we do away with corporate personhood, we can maybe start working on the other stuff.
A lot of pro-democracy agendas out there in the crowd tonight. We've got 3 questions and comments, and then we'll come back for a second round in a bit, and I guarantee we'll have time for a second round. So why don't we let you guys decide who wants to come up first. Who wants to take the initiative? You don't want me to start calling on people. I do a little teaching too.
The people at home would like you to repeat the question, whatever you're answering.
Well, I was going to speak to two of the questions, I guess, which had to do with the questions of pressure that exists on the administration. The issue of corporate personhood also, I think, is very important. What that refers to is the fact that corporations have rights. Corporations have been given rights in our legal system. This is something for the lawyers and law students out there, and can exist both at the state and federal level. And if corporations were treated as something other than people that had rights, it would be a very different world. But I wanted to speak to this issue of the pressures that exist. And I think the key thing is for us, more important than figuring out behind the scenes what are the pressures that may or may not be going on from the bad guys, what kind of pressure can we bring to bear? That's the issue. What's the pressure? And I think this notion of building a movement of the citizens of empire. There's a book called Citizens of Empire by a friend of many of ours, Robert Jensen, who teaches journalism, interestingly, at the University of Texas. And in his book, Bob talks about what it means to be the citizens of an empire. Remember what happened when the Roman Empire collapsed. The citizens of the empire were destroyed. The empire was destroyed in great fire, great violence. The question we have to ask is, what would it take to bring down the empire without that violence, using the tools of nonviolence, the tools that remain of democracy? How do we, as the citizens of empire, bring down the empire, protecting the people? And that's a huge challenge, but I think it has a lot to do with raising the political cost. Raising the political cost of these decisions so that it becomes more expensive politically for President Obama or these members of Congress to ignore their pledges or what they should be doing based on who elected them, and instead recognize that it's going to cost them more in the long run to not do that than to do it. That's the kind of movement that we have to build. That starts with education. It's all about advocacy. It's all about changing the discourse. Changing the discourse doesn't transform the policies. Those of us who have been working on Israel-Palestine for a really long time know that. The last 3 years we've seen an incredible transformation of the discourse, so that talk of Israel's apartheid policies, Israeli war crimes, are all part of the common parts of our discourse. It has not yet changed the policy, but it is raising the political cost. When you have all those pro-Israeli, uncritical of Israel organizations coming out against Barack Obama for all the obvious reasons, and yet 78% of American Jews vote for Barack Obama, that's raising the political cost. It's not enough yet. It takes years to transform political discourse into a different political set of policies. But this is the stage, and that's what our job has to do. Build a movement that raises the cost. Because when politicians see the cost, that's their calculation. If it costs more to do the wrong thing, they're going to do the right thing. Because it's to their advantage. That's the bad part of our system, but it's what we have to work with.
I don't mean this to be a question that was addressed to Jeremy, but I just wanted to answer, or kind of say something about the first question that was asked about your protest. You asked a question about protesting at Lockheed Martin it was, every Martin Luther King Day, and it seems fruitless. And it may seem pompous of me, but I can tell you why. Because you're organizing a tactic instead of organizing. I'm going to disagree with something that Kevin said earlier, which he said we need to be out there protesting. I totally disagree with that 100%. Protesting is a tactic used by organizers. We need to go out and organize. We have to out-organize the other side. Protesting is one of those tactics. Bringing pressure to Congress are a set of tactics. But we have to make sure that we're out organizing that. And it's not just a once a year, 1 day a year. It's the organizing every single day that may publicly manifest itself less often. But it's that work of making sure that we're creating that community, that we're organizing. This is the work that IBW does on a daily basis within the veteran and GI community. of organizing, of making sure that we're creating that community. And it's a much harder goal. It's much more difficult to do. It's very trying, but it's effective. It works. The civil rights movement didn't happen because of lunch counter sit-in. It happened because of the months and years of organizing before that. Rosa Parks wasn't some woman who was just hired one day. She was a trained organizer. That's what we need to do.
Well, the question that was directly asked to me about Lockheed Martin, I think we live in times where three major things are happening that are hurting social justice activism. One, and perhaps most importantly, is the sort of mass co-optation or surrender, or co-optation by the Democratic Party during the last couple of election cycles of social justice movements, and the Obama people were very effective at this. Howard Dean was pretty effective at it. Kerry was moderately effective with it, but Obama just took it over the fence and really co-opted large sectors of the sort of organized peace movement. The other part is that I think that online social networking, the prevalence of the internet now, I think has kept a lot of people from leaving their computers when it comes to thinking about activism. A lot of people think that emails are activism, and they can be, or that blogging is activism, and it can be. But if your only connection to the outside world, or your only connection to confronting those in power is your internet connection, then I think you have a very serious problem in front of you. And I think that that's depleting numbers, and I think we've seen it quite radically over the past decade, the decline in numbers of people that show up. And there are other factors, but I think that certainly is one of them. I think it's great when I go to a community and people say, well, we've had this vigil going for 10 years at this company. Let's remember, Lockheed Martin is the biggest defense contractor in the United States of America. If you guys aren't confronting them here, who will? And I think that it's sad, but entirely predictable that you send 600 press releases out and don't get a single camera or a single reporter. That's the way the corporate media function. They're not interested. Look at when Winter Soldier hearings were held in Maryland. You had all these Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. I was down there and honored to be one of this quote-unquote civilians asked to testify. There was a counter demonstration of about 12 people who were crazy people. They got, and I say that literally, I mean, they were saying things that were just absolutely nonsensical and yelling at veterans and in a way that was just, I mean, it was lunacy. But the point here is, the Washington Post was the only major paper to cover Winter Soldier, and they covered it in the Metro section. And they gave equal time to 12 people that had gathered there. It was on the anniversary of the invasion and occupation of Iraq. You had scores of veterans, not all of whom were on the same page by any means. It was an incredible opportunity for media organizations to rise to the occasion and interview these people. And yet they put them on the same level as 12 astroturfers who just showed up to yell at them as they came in there. So I understand why you would say, I don't want to spend my time doing this anymore, or it's not getting anywhere. I think, though, that we are moving toward a situation in this country where fewer and fewer people are going to be able to stand by and be silent. And I think it would be important to maintain that vigil at Lockheed Martin. We see this movement against Blackwater not taking hold in New York or Washington, D.C., but in rural communities where Blackwater is building these compounds. 30 people were arrested at the gates of Blackwater a few months ago in Mount Carroll, Illinois, a place that most people have never even heard of, where Blackwater set up a camp. A tiny town of 900 people in Southern California beat Blackwater and chased them out of their town. Blackwater spent $1 million fighting a town of 900 people, and they lost. And they lost because that town came together. They went after and they had a recall of all of the members of their local planning commission that had voted in secret to authorize Blackwater's presence. They did grassroots activism, they did networking, they had people from around the country coming to help them, and they went after those elected officials that were cutting secret deals with a mercenary company behind the scenes. There are examples of citizen movements and ordinary folks rising up and actually winning, but these things take time, and they sometimes take many, many decades. Regarding the issue of corporate personhood, I completely agree that we should have campaigns that, and there have been campaigns that directly target the rights of corporations that are meant to be equal to human rights. In many cases, corporations have more rights than people do. One recent thing that's happened is that the war companies that are being sued for their crimes abroad and domestically are appealing to Attorney General Eric Holder to certify them as what's called a Westfall defendant. The Westfall Act was passed during the Reagan administration as a way of trying to shield federal employees from individual tort liability for torts committed during the course of their government service. In other words, the government would intervene if an individual federal employee was sued by a private person for an alleged crime or violation committed while on the sort of payroll for the government. Donald Rumsfeld was certified as a Westfall defendant in a torture case by the Eric Holder Justice Department recently. And what that means is that the U.S. government replaces the name Donald Rumsfeld in the defendant listing for the case. Companies are now appealing, and Blackwater just did this a few weeks ago, to Eric Holder to certify Blackwater as a Westfall defendant for their war crimes in Iraq, in the case where the Iraqis are suing them. And they have asked Attorney General Holder to make the U.S. government the defendant in the 5 cases in the Eastern District of Virginia alleging war crimes against Blackwater. The issue of corporate personhood once was something that sort of existed in the abstract. Today, you have these companies that are effectively mercenary killing squads around the world that are making the machinery that makes these illegal wars possible, and they are being shielded now by the Obama Justice Department under the idea that they are equivalent to one federal employee when it comes to the torts that they're committing against others. Ralph Nader recently told me when I interviewed him about this issue that he thinks that if the corporations want corporate personhood, that they should then have to face the corporate death penalty for their crimes. And then finally, in terms of Obama, the behind-the-scenes stuff that you asked about Obama and the issue of sort of what's happening there, I don't think, first of all, I don't think that this is going to be a I fooled you moment with Barack Obama where he's going to sort of have a campaign on a pro-war platform and then turn around and end the wars. Even as Kevin rightly points out, his Iraq platform is actually not one that crisply and cleanly will ever end the occupation. Phyllis knows as well as anyone, they're going to have these mercenary forces at that massive Baghdad embassy that's the size of 80 football fields as long as that remains the U.S. embassy. Most countries have a modest embassy. We have an embassy that is the size of Vatican City. The Vatican has embassies in other countries. We have an embassy that's the size of the Vatican. That's going to require a massive mercenary force. I think that we're seeing a disturbing trend in the Obama administration now, where I think we have more and more right-wing forces that are being put into second-tier positions at DOD and NSA. And I think that the hawks that are at the top of those platforms are all part of the sort of corporate party. And that's kind of sober reality right now. I think we're going to see these wars get worse, not more peaceful. I'll pass out razor blades later.
It's a two-party system, the war party, warring party.
One thing we haven't answered is the question of military conversions. And when you look at the infrastructure of the United States, for year after year, the Engineers Association is putting out reports that talks about the trillions of dollars needed to repair our infrastructure. We easily have enough to do in the United States, rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding mass transit, creating a green economy, that there is a lot of business to be had if we start to focus on building a new economy. So that, I think, military conversion is a real issue, a real possibility. And if we start to talk about, as I said earlier, the issue of empire, we can then also talk about what it would mean if we could invest in ourselves rather than keeping troops abroad, rather than keeping the military budget as big as the whole world combined. That would just make an incredible difference in our lives, and to put forward the vision of the fantasy of what it would be like to actually invest in our own lifestyle would be quite a vision for America to hear. You mentioned co-option as one of the reasons we have problems. I think the biggest problem we face is a sense of powerlessness, that what we do makes no difference. So your Lockheed Martin example, I've been out there at Lockheed Martin as well demonstrating. They seem to set those things up to make demonstrations impossible, don't they? they're like fortresses, and they're far away from the road, so no one can see them. It's just, they seem to think that through as they develop these places. But as far as powerlessness goes, it's often hard to tell how powerful you are, how our impact what the impact of our work is. Because so often when you're making progress and pushing a new agenda, the status quo stiffens its back. And they look at it getting stronger and stronger. You know, you start to see decriminalization of marijuana, you get mandatory sentencing. You start to see the abolitionists make progress in the early 1800s, and you see the Fugitive Slave Act. So sometimes the stiffening of the back is really a signal that we're getting close. It's like we're pounding on a wall, and we're chipping away at it, chipping away at it. We don't know how thick that wall is. We could be chipping away to the point where it's paper thin and say, God, I give up. I'll never see the light come through that wall. We could be so close, we just don't know it. And so we have to always kind of take this, we should always feel that we're having an impact. We should recognize our power. And so we shouldn't, back down. Maybe the demonstrations at Lockheed Martin aren't the right approach, but pressuring Lockheed Martin is the right approach. Pressuring these corporations is the right approach. On the healthcare debate, there's a well-organized single-payer healthcare community. It's been around for a long time. It's growing, has widespread support. And we were focusing in the early part of this healthcare debate on the politicians directly. And it didn't have much impact. It didn't seem like. And so we have to try new tactics. And sometimes going at things indirectly rather than directly. The politicians gained, Walker's got more than $3.5 million from the insurance industry. So we have to combat that. So it's pretty hard to go at him directly, especially when he was just reelected last year. And so we have to try to come at these things sometimes indirectly. You mentioned the lunch counter sit-ins. The target wasn't just the lunch counter. The target was the politicians who put in place Jim Crow. And so they came at it indirectly. They highlighted what was wrong with the present system. And so I think sometimes we have to figure out ways to come at these things indirectly and use our power that way. We're starting a project now called Mobilization for Healthcare, which is focusing on the insurance industry denials. 20% of the cases now, when the doctor recommends healthcare, the patient says yes, the health insurance company says no, 20% of the time. Those denials need to be highlighted. And I think the same way, we can find those kinds of angles on all these corporate issues. Because all these, despite corporations being legally defined as persons, in fact they're not. They are seeking out profit. They are essentially heartless in their pursuit of profit. And their heartlessness makes them vulnerable. It makes them unpopular. It's amazing how when you talk about issues of corporate power in almost any audience, they react. They're concerned about it. They know. People know corporations are abusing their power. And so we need to find those kind of make these corporations radioactive so in fact they do pay a political price. The politicians do pay a political price for associating with them so that they become so radioactive that it's not worth their time to be associated with those, because what's more important than the corporate dollars is getting reelected. That's their ultimate goal. The dollars are a tool to that goal. And so stopping their re-elections by making those corporations so radioactive and unpopular is a tactic we consider. So whether it's Lockheed Martin demonstrations or some other approach from Lockheed Martin, we do need to focus on these military corporations who are profiting from war and destruction.
Okay, so I'll come at this from a different approach. You mentioned what happens behind the scenes. But I think we should look at what happened before the election. They put a candidate up there. First it was Hillary Clinton, and everybody was really mobilizing around Hillary Clinton. And then when it was seen that she was losing some steam and some ground, all of a sudden this candidate emerged, Barack Obama. And the anti-war movement and other movements in this country that were starting to gain momentum started to get behind Barack Obama, because Hillary Clinton's big downfall was that she voted for the war. And the anti-war movement was really not behind her. So the powers that be, or these corporations, that now we see them lobbying relentlessly, especially healthcare industry right now. I don't remember who said it, but one of the congresspeople was saying that it might have been Bernie Sanders, that he saw them with money actually paying off these congresspeople so that they don't vote for healthcare, so that they take the public option out of the system, so that they put down single payer. But what happened is, so the anti-war movement and others in the country saw this man rise to power, and so did the people in power. So did people in the ruling class that have the money, like the Democratic National Committee. They have tons of money. They're funded by the corporations, not only the Republican committee, but the Democrat. It's equally the same. It's the same amount of money. So here he comes, and he's now quelching the people that are now really gaining momentum, trying to get Bush out of office, trying to get the wars ended, trying to get their rights and standing up for themselves. People of this country are mobilizing. He comes forward and they see that, well, maybe they'll go behind this particular candidate, which they did. He was standing there saying, I'm going to escalate the Afghanistan war, as Kevin and Jeremy said. I heard it. He said that we're going to maybe withdraw some troops from Iraq. But he stood by the SOFA. We were demanding that the SOFA be introduced to Congress. Since it was introduced to the parliament in Iraq, why shouldn't Congress look at it and take a vote on it? But he didn't do that.
That's the status of forces agreement.
Right, the status of forces agreement. When he came into office. So they knew exactly what they were doing by putting him in office, by putting him out there, and he fought it lock, stock, and barrel. For whatever reason, he was never the anti-war candidate. He was never the one that was going to be the savior or the change. That was just rhetoric. And everyone bought it. And now we're all scratching our heads saying, wait a minute, he said he was change. Change for who? Certainly not for us. We're still here. Certainly not for the Iraqis or the Afghan people or in Pakistan or even the soldiers. There's a bigger GI resistance movement right now than we have ever seen. So I'm telling you that there's nothing behind the scenes after the election. It happens before the election, but we just don't see it because we're not paying attention to it. There was media hype around it. Here he is, the first African American that's won the nomination. He has the possibility of winning the White House. Everybody got behind him for that reason. And the corporations and the powers that be in this country stood back and watched. And they laughed at us. And that's exactly what they're doing now. So we have to be very careful about who they put up front and center. And the other thing as far as Lockheed Martin, Gene, it's true. I mean, I've been to protests where 2 or 3 people are there. But we look at Paula in Teaneck with MFSO. Now, they've been out there 4 years. And they had very, very small vigils. But they kept at it. And now, they have people from the community joining them. It's the visibility. And eventually, people get it. And that's the way this GUARD campaign is. Eventually, people get it. And they want to join in. And they want to sign the petition. So we have to keep even the smallest amount of protests in the streets, because people do see you, and they do go home and they sit there at their dinner table and they say, you know, those people are out there again today, and that's Lockheed Martin. What's that all about? So we did that at the Army Experience Center in Philly, and now we have national and international media covering it. So that's what I learned.
So this is what we're going to do. And you can tell that there's some disagreement on the panel, but there's a consensus that we don't trust the executive branch, right? I think there's a very clear sense of the panel here. I want to make sure that people have the chance to make their comments or ask their questions. So I think what we're going to do is we'll allow you to do that, and then we'll just wrap formally, and we'll have a chance to have some informal discussion afterwards. But you had your hand up, and then the gentleman in front, and then this gentleman over here, the green. Yes.
Okay.
Is your mic on?
Yes.
Okay,
I have 2 quick comments. As to the corporate personhood, I don't know how many of you listen to left-wing radio, but Tom Hartman has uncovered a small technicality in this law, and I'm surprised the lawyers haven't mentioned it, but according to Tom, what happened in that whole decision is that the court reporter made an error in typing in the introduction to the reporting of the bill, and in the actual bill, it never says that there is such a thing as corporate personhood.
You're referring to the Santa Clara decision, right?
Right.
And a good resource for that is Program on Corporations, Law and Democracy.
Okay. Second thing, and I got this from Mike Malloy, and this has been just spinning in my head now for 6 months since he first brought this up. But his idea is a day of stop. You stop going to work. You stop going to school for 24 hours. You buy nothing. No clothing, no foodstuffs. You turn off your lights. You're not using utilities. You don't drive your car. And for one 24-hour period, don't tell me the economic picture won't change and that we won't get their attention.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front.
Does this work? Okay. Hold it down to work. My name is Ron Fisher. I had to be a Captain Navy retired. I'm a nuke submariner, graduate Naval Academy. And I have a quote plan, but the question I wanted to lead up to, there's several things I'm suggesting here on what I call.
A little short.
Okay, the question is use of criminal prosecutions, and in particular, the Bugliosi approach is that obviously Bush is guilty, but also Congress is guilty of aiding and abetting. And the idea, we haven't been able to find a prosecutor yet, but the crime has infinite, statute of limitations doesn't expire. Any prosecutor in the United States could do this. And I just happen to believe the threat of that. And I'm anxious to hear some answers about it, and also to take a look at this sometime the weekend of how we might go about that. Thank you.
My name is Michael. The question I have is easily answered, I think, by Jeremy, and it has to do with your reference to Rahm Emanuel and a promise to go light. I was aware of arm twisting on the Democrats, but I wasn't aware of promises to go light. Are you morally certain of that? I'm not going to ask you who told you, but are you morally certain of that, and can you identify which Republicans were promised a light treatment? Because I think there are other things that are possible.
So there are some direct questions, and I had also said we would try to wrap here. Do you think you might be able to give a 30-second response? Anybody here? Not possible. Okay. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to say. What? It sounds like you're being drafted, Jeremy.
I just want to find one thing that someone else.
Okay. So while he's doing that, we will have a direct response. Anybody else has a direct response? It's very quick. Okay. Well, what I would like to do is I would like to take this opportunity to give the panel something which they deserve much earlier in the evening, which is a round of applause all together. And for helping us to launch Who Decides About War, and I think we've gotten off to a great start. And what we will do is we will leave, for those who are watching online or who are watching later, we will leave the camera running, so maybe we can even have Jeremy come up here and address it directly into the camera. I want to thank all of you. Feel free to stick around for a little while. And again, we reconvene tomorrow morning. Be here bright and early. We'll have some refreshments provided by Benson and Sarah Scotch. Put those together for us. And get here, please, by 8:45 so we can start at 9 on time.
Could I just say one thing? Every year, the day before Thanksgiving, for the last 12 years or so, has been recognized as Buy Nothing Day.
Right.
And I write articles for op-ed news, and I've been writing articles about this for the last 3 years. And in fact, I interviewed one of the Green Party members who does this in Rhode Island. So that already exists. I wanted to just let some...
There's many strategies and opportunities here, and let's take advantage of the time that we have right now to network and So if somebody asked a question or made a comment, take the opportunity to talk with them. And thank you all very much for your participation tonight, too.
Just to answer your question directly, so at the time when this was happening, there were a handful of online news sites that are very credible that were talking to congressional offices. I was one of the people doing that work. That particular allegation about Rahm Emanuel came from Jane Hampshire at Firedog Lake, who is an impeccable source and is an incredibly well-connected online journalist. And she reported that at the time. One of the Republicans that was said to have been flipped is John McHugh from New York, who actually is now in the Obama administration. And it was a bit of a scandal on the right at the time that he was flipping with the White House because talks were underway for him to actually take a position within the administration, which he now has done, and there's a very hot contest for his seat. As for other Republicans, I don't think anyone ever named who they were. I think that this came from sources at the White House talking to Jane Hampshire is my understanding of it. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, everybody. You got a copy.
Have a bookmark. I'm a prolific playwright. I was a Duke something.
Well, my great-grandfather well, actually, never met him. Yeah, he was Moss. It would have been John. He was hilarious.
I made and the glass that I was on, separate foreheads. Separate targets. It is terrifying. It is so stupid. And I would have done that. I drank the Kool-Aid there for a while. And people have, and I have the other thing is the tradition that I've been trying to maintain in something before. You got the there too. And we were taking leads together when they looked at it. And I was pretty good at that because the tutor didn't look at he's absolutely changed. I think he could change. I'm believing Obama could change tomorrow. I don't. And the other thing, I got to see the capitalism movie Monday evening. Mike Moore was there over in Maryland. They invited some of the activists around here, and it was fantastic. It was really that movie is really worth seeing.
Fantastic. Are you going to be here tomorrow too?
I'm going to be here. Oh, absolutely. I'll be here. You can't keep me away.
All right. And, are you Samantha? Hey, very good to meet you. Yeah, very good. Were you? Did I miss you earlier? Or I might have. You were in the back.
Yeah.
So you're going to be here tomorrow too?
Yeah. I started
9 in the morning. Yes, I know. Benson's scheduled there, but I'm on that schedule now too. I was going to ask you if you might be willing to introduce Jeremy tomorrow. Yeah, but they're high-powered. I hadn't actually met Jeff before. I didn't know. So funny, it made me think. Feel more yeah, I'm like, oh, you're going too far. Well, I haven't done it. Yeah, we're good. There's a couple things. office. No, we have an opposition mentality. We are an opposition. So, but I think that there are, I think there are some other points of view within the last one. Yeah, I do.
Oh,
Where are you? I'm with IPS.
I couldn't figure out if you guys can use direct just to get my strip.
Yeah, you gotta. So I always do a self-critique. We'll figure it out.
Confident.
Yeah. It's good to hear from you.
It's not the best neighborhood. It's more of what I'm worried about. Yeah, we'll figure out. I'm in New Bedford right now. I'm in Roxbury before. So.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about too much. I think we have it.
Like a literal crackboard, not like
Got my umbrella, thank you.
Agatha was here and was very helpful.
So we have to put it in my truck.
The AV guy was a little bit ornery.
Because I know I don't know. That's right, I know where they live. All right, so we'll just.
Because we're going to be having panels tomorrow. So the class set on can only accommodate 2 chairs. So you can't have a panel discussion. So yeah, I mean, but so yeah, it's all good. It's all good. There's some running around. Sarah and I, my wife Sarah, and everybody got her. We're looking for camera equipment. What's the plan?
I had a conference call with Secret Service. I'm like, oh no! Well, they wouldn't let us put in the car. I was hot. I was burning hot.
Try to find somebody who's subsidized. He suggested maybe call
He's like, I'm there for lunch.
I wasn't we got that event, and I know he's on but I'm going to be back to make the round. What's your point?